Well, Mark Latham joins us this time every week. Before we go to Mark, though, because he has some extraordinary things to say about all of that, get a weather report because Mark's at home. Rain's caused havoc on the roads. What's it like out there, Mark?
Well, Alan, we all love the rain, don't we? But we've had too much. It's flooded and dangerous. So thanks for having me on the show from the safety of my home office.
Not at all. I'll be looking at what this means, the weather and everything for people, with Michael McLaren later on the program. But Daniel Andrews, as you heard me say, he couldn't answer any questions about the private security plans for guarding the quarantine hotels. His response: there is a decision to establish it. It then gets established. It's then run by multiple agencies, and beyond that, we can't be certain, we can't be sure, we can't answer many of the very important questions. You're saying the job was given to a Sydney-based firm, Unified Security, because they were Indigenous.
Well, that's right. Andrews must know the truth of this, that Unified Security has an office in Ashfield in Sydney. So how they got the bulk of the hotel quarantine work in Melbourne, of course, is unusual in itself. You'd expect a Labor government down there, a left-wing Labor government, to bring in the public sector, but they put it out to the private sector. And Unified Security weren't on the established list, the panel of security providers for the Victorian government. So they came in from outside, they came in from New South Wales, and they got the bulk of the work. And there's also a suggestion, as of the 21st of June, they didn't even have a valid security licence to operate in Melbourne. So how did they get it? It was issued out of the Victorian Department of Jobs, where the officer there had previous contact with Unified Security, an Indigenous-owned firm, when she was working at the charity, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. So, Alan, this emphasises a point you and I have made for quite some time. If you issue these contracts to do with public safety on the basis of identity politics, race, gender or sexuality, instead of merit, the best person, the best firm for the job, then inevitably you end up with problems and, in this case, a national disaster.
But this outfit weren't, as I understand it, on the government's preferred panel of security suppliers.
No, that's right. They got the bulk of the work, even though they weren't listed. Most state governments, when they put out tenders, have a list of preferred suppliers. They send out the tender documentation and it goes from there, hopefully on the basis of cost effectiveness. But Unified Security, solely for the reason that they're Indigenous-owned, got the inside running. And they had this contact with a senior officer in the Department of Jobs. They got it because of their aboriginality in ownership. And, of course, we know the rest of the story, the incompetence, the problems, the disaster, the spread of the virus. So,
that's right.
You know, it emphasises the point, nothing beats merit, nothing beats giving these contracts to organisations that are best qualified to get the job done.
Just let me
come back. When you're talking about public safety, you've got no alternative.
Just let me come back to the first point you made. Is Daniel Andrews telling the truth when he says he doesn't know?
No, I wouldn't think so. He must have had briefings now from the head of the Department of Jobs, his relevant ministers. He must know what's at the bottom of this. He's hiding, of course. It's a fig leaf disguise to hide behind the inquiry that's underway, to say, oh, you know, we'll let the inquiry sort it out. But he must have had by now briefings on what happened with Unified Security, how they got the work, the identity politics involved, the lack of merit selection, the lack of competence. I mean, how could you be running Victoria today and not ask the basic question of your senior ministers and bureaucrats, how did this ever go so wrong?
Absolutely. Brilliant. Albion Park High School, Mark, we talked about this last week, about the school assembly at the Albion Park High School and the relieving principal, Christine Campbell, on about Black Lives Matters, prejudice and hate, more deaths in custody for Indigenous people than for non-Indigenous, which simply isn't true. And people then wrote to me in droves and saying, what is happening to this principal? What's happened?
Well, I've asked the question. There's a notional New South Wales government policy on controversial issues. You're not supposed to have them in the schools unless the parents agree. The school gets to define controversial issues. So I've asked what action's been taken against the school, given that this sort of political campaign shouldn't be happening. It's a disgrace that students were kneeling to a neo-Marxist organisation that wants to defund the police. How would that play in working class Illawarra? Defund the police, everyone exposed to crime and disorder. So I'm finding out as best I can what's happened there, and there's a lesson for other school leaders around New South Wales. Keep the politics to yourself. If you want to kneel to Black Lives Matter, do it in your own time. Don't make students do it.
Absolutely.
And don't bring your own personal politics to socially engineer an outcome in schools. Stick to the fundamentals of giving these kids their best start in life through academic attainment and qualifications.
We've got to stick on this, Mark, this business about indoctrination and the dishonesty of it. I mean, the Royal Commission, just repeating what we said last week, found Indigenous people are not more likely to die in custody than other Australians. And my emails were on fire, wanting to know what's happened to this teacher. So, Mark, you keep at it, and I'll write to the Education Minister, Sarah Mitchell, as well. Look, I want to raise this issue with you as Inland Rail. You're the leader of One Nation. Many of your supporters are west of the Great Dividing Range, good bush people. This is one of the issues that the federal government and the National Party don't want to talk about. It's 1,700 kilometres. It's a $10 billion inland rail. It's supposed to go from Melbourne to Brisbane, but it'll stop 38 kilometres short of the port of Brisbane. There's the picture of it on your map there. All the freight will then be chucked onto trucks to travel through the streets of Brisbane. And they say tens of thousands of trucks will be taken off the highways. The trains will be double stacked and up to 1,800 metres long. That's 18 lengths of a football field. But the Farmers Inland Rail Task Force says there has to be an independent inquiry. The route is going to impact 300 farmers in Western New South Wales. It'll be a new track when the existing track could have been upgraded for a fraction of the cost and farmers wouldn't have been impacted. Mark, what are your thoughts on this before I go to Adrian Lyons, who is leading the farmers in this protest against what's happening?
Well, my first thought is that the 300 farmers have got property rights. I mean, this is such a basic aspect of how we should run a modern economy. People have property rights and should be treated with respect and get their due compensation. But that's a very hard thing to enforce in New South Wales, as we've discussed on other issues, Alan. So the property rights are paramount. The route should be subject to the minimal amount of disturbance to those property rights, and it should be subject to full cost-benefit analysis, because if you're trying to create jobs, the evidence has got to be there that this is a big job creator. So if it doesn't stack up against other projects, you shouldn't be going ahead.